I'm going to apologize in advance for some of these slides. Any one of these slides could probably be a week-long course by itself in terms of the nature of it. But I thought it was really important to try and give a presentation that really presents, I think, some of the contexts in terms of what we're undertaking with the wastewater harmonization in terms of its good things, and at the same time put into some context of some of the challenges that are being seen by it. And this presentation, it came from two opportunities this year, two major ones. I had the opportunity to make a presentation to the Canadian Bar Association of Alberta on their environmental one, and that was one. And trying to prepare a presentation for lawyers, that was interesting. But it brought forward some aspects of trying to put it into a context of law, and I think that's important because ultimately we're exposed to, with the wastewater regulation, the context of the law. That is what the regulators are enforcing, is the law, and I think it's a good idea to have the context of that, of what it brings to it, and at the same time explaining it or trying to put it in the context of having to operate or design or whatever systems. The other impetus for this presentation was helping out a few communities this year with water license compliance related issues. In particular, Dawson, where I've spent a lot of time, Nunavut, Fort Simpson, and Fort Smith. Each of them have had water license compliance related issues that sort of fall into play. I wanted to really highlight sort of case studies or some of their challenges to bring into context. And again, everybody's different. Every single community's challenges are very unique, but there's sort of some broad things that you can see, okay, Fort Smith is having to do this. Well, yeah, actually, water license is being renewed or whatever, so you can bring it into your own. But just being aware of that, and even being in a position to ask questions and saying, well, okay, that's Simpson, what about us? So those are the two things, and then I'll sort of end off the presentation talking about, I guess, more philosophically, saying that if we're moving forward in this, where could we possibly end up? And I think we've got a very significant opportunity here to see as it rolls out, to take the opportunity to make it work for the North. What is bad about sewage? And again, this is something that, as most people are sort of already aware of, and it's compressed right into one slide. So we've got environment and we've got public health issues. So in environment, we've got oxygen depletion, and this is a curve. So as something is put into a river or something, it's biological, and with time, if it moves down a river, the oxygen will deplete. That's sort of the basic in terms of the environmental. We've got eutrophication, nutrients, nitrogen and phosphorus. So if they get into a lake, the things start growing, and they start growing quickly. So that's a general case. And then we've got toxicity. And I think that's sort of the big one in terms of the environment, is that sewage is toxic to aquatic life. The other side of it is public health. Any waterborne organisms from sewage do cause disease. So that's the basic context, and that's how I explained to lawyers, and I think most of them got it. The other side is modern wastewater treatment. This is an area that, even in the work I do, a lot of it is outside my scope of practice and my expertise, because we now have a whole bunch of mechanical systems, and they've got a bunch of acronyms: MBR, SBR, RBC. These are all these mechanical, very sophisticated technologies that have been developed and work very well over the last probably 3 or 4 decades. MBR is membrane bioreactor. SBR is sequencing. So all these technologies that are available. Then we've got the lagoon systems. And again, how different lagoon systems work with their anaerobic, aerobic, facultative. There are 1,000 sewage lagoons serving 50% of Canadians' population. A very significant amount of lagoon systems. And that's part of our discussion as to, with the various presentation of lagoon systems, wetland. And then we've got the whole nitrate or the whole ammonia discussion. But each one of these could probably be a separate week-long presentation. But I wanted to sort of put that out there, bringing these terms that you're already, I think, aware of them, but sort of make them fresh in your mind because they're significant in the problem solving to wastewater. I think a singular thing is that lagoon systems work in a general sense. We've got sunlight providing energy, we've got wind, we've got air, so that any of the mechanical system unto themselves is really a basin with all these inputs. It's just in an engineered fashion. So lagoon systems do work. Now you bring that to the north. Okay, we've got the sunlight, we've got the wind, we've got warm temperatures. Okay, so all of a sudden you bring them north. They still work, but now the segment of time that they will work in is compressed, right? Because you've got winter. So that really reduces the window that these systems will work. This is a graph of sewage treatment in Iqaluit, and it starts in December and goes for 1 year. So this just shows it, right? During the winter months up there, right? This is BOD, is that the system doesn't work that well. During the summer months, May, June, July, and August, it does work, reduces, and then it goes back up. So that's the challenge, is that these lagoon systems work, but because of the temperature and the daylight, they have the operating windows for the north really impair the operation for seasonally. This was an article that I wrote last year and was blasted by Mary. Thank you very much for that. And again, that's not an embarrassment. That's the dialogue that we need to have about, challenges for the North. This was a report that Dylan had prepared, is that really the identification of accessibility of water license compliance-related points remains a challenge. So this goes that accessibility 50%, no access 20%, boat helicopter access 8%. So we've got this in terms of regulatory compliance. You've got this water license, you've got the set of criteria, so you need to actually get information so you can compare to your water license, and being able to do that is a challenge. The challenge will probably reduce with time, but it probably, in some aspects, I know for the city of Yellowknife has a wetland, sort of lagoon wetland system. The only way they can get their compliance points is by helicopter, and I don't think that will ever change. The transportation of wastewater samples. This was out of the Dillon report that shows the transportation of a water sample or sewage sample out of Grise Fjord starting and up over a 1, 2, 3, 4 day, a 5-day period before it got to the lab. And really what you're seeing is the temperature monitoring and going up and down and taking time. This is a challenge, and again, in looking at 25 years, that has improved to some degree, but probably will always face challenges. Try and put a wastewater sample on a flight out of Grise Fjord and you get it down to, I guess the closest lab is Ottawa, and get that down within the 48-hour period. It's a challenge. In fact, I don't know if you can even do it. And that will, I think, always remain a challenge to some degree. You've got this water license, you've got compliance numbers, information, and then you have to send and get this data. So that is another challenge that remains and will always remain. So I wanted to put those sort of general context of some of the challenges that we faced. I wanted to get some of the blessings. The anticipated implementation of the harmonized regulations is expected to have a one-stop shop. And I think there's not an operator or administrator in a community that would really not like to have that. If not having sort of one portal, one group that you have to deal with, rather than having various groups come at you and say, okay, we want this sampling here, we want that sampling there. You have various visits by various regulators. Having the opportunity that you'll just have one portal, so dealing with your compliance issues, that communication is singular rather than multiple. Because I think that's very frustrating and also very, I think, intimidating for a lot of communities when you have different individuals coming in and asking you different things. So this is a blessing that we're anticipating out of the harmonization. Having a view as an old guy for 3 decades, there has not been a single period of time where I have not seen more wastewater research. And again, I'm an applied scientist, so I'm an engineer, and when I see lots of data coming, I get excited. So we've got all this data out there, and that is, I think, one of the singular blessings. We've got all this information at an all-time high. It's being collected and compiled, and I think with the communication opportunities we have with this conference, with the internet, is that information is going to be extremely valuable. So that's a really blessing. And this is just showing a BOD bottle and a fecal coliform plate. I have to admit it, I am a consultant, and not quite as fast as that one, is that there's been an extraordinary amount of consulting-related work coming out of this, which is good. It's creating a lot of information, I presume a lot of useful information, of course. So that has been sort of a blessing, that there is this work that is ongoing in terms of association with the CCME guidelines. The dialogue with the regulators is probably the most important blessing, I think, that we're having out of this whole process. We've got a very strong representation at this conference. We've got a very strong input to the magazine. That certainly there are probably at least 2 or 3 articles in every issue of the magazine from the regulators. We've got Mary and Jane at the conference last year, and they've had various workshops. This one was in 2002 that I attended, I think, in Burlington. So we've got this interaction and a direct interaction. It's not that we're reading articles. We've got individuals that we're dealing with on a regular basis, and there's a familiarity. And I think that is probably the singular most important aspect that's occurring with the unfolding of the harmonization. And thank you very much for that. Now we get into the curse. Dealing with Nunavut. Nunavut has a continuous discharge primary lagoons, secondary lagoons, and discharging into the Mackenzie River. As part of their current water license, and I've just quoted from that, is that they're advancing their water license and they have to do an assessment of potential wastewater treatment options, make a plan, and have these options available so that they meet the territorial and federal guidelines. And this is really causing them not a lot of financial grief, but more saying, okay, what can we do? Ultimately, and there's that unknown factor, because in terms of actually meeting the guidelines, the 25-25 non-toxicity guidelines unto themselves, if you look just in simple process terms, is that with the factors that influence lagoon systems and wetland, if they're a continuous discharge, is they won't meet that. And again, we can argue that point, but really from a process perspective, the only way you're going to meet that is with a mechanical system. Okay, what's a mechanical system worth? Well, if you're up in Dawson, and Dawson I'll talk more about that, that's a $25 million hit in capital. That's an extreme case, but again, we're talking about what is the potential cost. And I think that's what you want to be aware of. It's saying it's somewhere, I think Dawson had 2 proposals that were submitted as part of the design-build process, and they were between $15 and $25 million for a community of 2,000. I'm involved in that project, but it's not my process, so I'm involved as really overseeing the design builder. That's one thing that is being paid by the federal government. Thank you very much. You could say the funding will come from other sources potentially, but still, $25 million, that's the singular most expensive water treatment system in the north. The only thing that comes close to that is a potable water treatment system that's being designed and possibly constructed in Yellowknife, and I think that's going to come in at a measly $20 million. So if you're talking about scale, the O&M side of it is really, sort of jumping ahead, that's really the singular legacy that communities will face, is how many hundreds of thousands of dollars are going to cost. It's estimated for Dawson that their O&M will probably be about $300,000 to $500,000 a year. That's still to be determined, but that's still a big hit. So this is Nunavut, that their current water license is 7150. So there's a sense of apprehension as these things unfold, what ultimate technology will be required for them to meet those guidelines. It's sort of an unknown, and that's really for them causing them a lot of, apprehension. Fort Simpson is currently under a regulatory directive. And again, each of these communities has its own unique history in terms of how the project unfolded. Fort Simpson had a wastewater treatment plant that was a design build put into play back, I think, in about 1993, 94, somewhere in there. And the process has worked through time, but it's had its issues. They have now received this directive, and this is actually quoting from the directives, I think, Environment Canada officers. So he's aware that Fort Simpson owns a deleterious substance, such as the sewage, and is discharging it. So it's strictly saying, okay, they recognize it now, they need to fix it. We're advancing a new treatment system, looking at a mechanical system, essentially replacing or upgrading what they've got. And from the financial side of it, the numbers that were put forward to the GNWT and to MACA were suggesting that it would have cost upward of $8 million, which by Dawson standards is actually quite cheap, but still $8 million. But really the kicker is that they were anticipating that the O&M could be as high as $1 million a year. The community will be bankrupt in a year. They can't sustain that. And again, these are general numbers, but that's sort of Fort Simpson right now they're under a lot of stress right now with this. They're having to report monthly. They've got a new, I think, SAO who just started this week. So he's coming in and going, okay, what do we have to do? In terms of having a 3-decade perspective on this, it was interesting back in the late 80s when I was working with Simpson on implementing this project. One of the numbers that stuck with me is that the Mackenzie River at that point, and if you take the Mackenzie River, it's a big river, right? It's huge. That at its lowest potential flow, that if you discharge sewage into the Mackenzie River, the dilution rate is about 300,000 to 1. And I just sort of put that number out to you. That's a lot of dilution. Fort Smith's wastewater, we've been helping them out with their water license renewal, and they've gone through that process, and it was submitted back in the summer. And during that process, there were quite a number of regulatory interventions in that process, and that really put the community at sort of in quite a bit of stress about recognizing that if certain regulatory requirements for their effluent quality were put into place, they would be in a situation that uncertainty, saying, okay, if we have these regulatory guidelines in place, will our lagoon work? Are we going to be under a situation of, say, Dawson going under a court order? So the arguments were put forward in defense of that, and we'll see when the water license comes back. This table actually at the bottom is not even readable. But it was interesting, as part of that exercise is that a report from Boulder Associates was commissioned and saying, okay, we've got the sewage discharge, we've got the Slave River. What in fact are the appropriate discharge guidelines into the Slave River? And it was interesting to note that their wastewater guidelines, they've got I think 200 and 300 BOD suspended solids, fairly sort of in the same ballpark. And I think out of that study, the actual guidelines for the receiving of BOD and suspended solids were very, very much above that, and really a reflection of the carrying capacity of the Slave River, which I think, again, in Smith is not the same as Simpson. I think their lowest dilution rate when the Slave is at its lowest point is probably about 60,000 to 1. Still pretty high. But it was interesting to have this study put out, and if anybody's interested in it, it added a sort of a new dimension of doing some science. The one thing, and I was pointing out that the natural attenuation that didn't work was actually ammonia. They were looking at saying, okay, that the natural attenuation didn't work, so that brings a question back in terms of the ammonia toxicity. But that was an interesting sideline. But Fort Smith has had a bit of a rough time this year. And getting to, say, the pet project, favorite of mine is Dawson City. I've got a few slides on that one. And the context I put it in is that this first number here is they've got an accumulation from 1994 to 2010, so about 15, 16 years of data that they've monitored the basic suspended solids BOD. So on average, their suspended solids is under 30 per year. That's on average. So that's not a bad number. On average, their BOD is about 40. On average, their fecal coliforms is about 1.5 million. So these, other than fecal coliforms, which are high, on average, their actual system works quite well. But you'll see on the upper slide, they've got a seasonal problem. Dawson is a mechanical screening system, so it doesn't suffer from the same climatic challenges as a lagoon system. But what they sort of suffer from or blessing from is that they do a lot of dilution. So for their pipe water system, they put in a lot of water in the wintertime to keep for the freeze protection. So they actually have a very dilute sewage during the wintertime. And as well is that Dawson, being a tourism town, is that they drop down to a population of 2,000 during this winter, and they'll double in population during the summer. So if you look at these numbers just in trends, is that just sort of January, February, March, April, that the actual concentrations of all the constituents is actually quite low. Then during the summer, when the bleeders and the population will bump back up, and then getting into September, October, December, it'll bump back down. So this is sort of let's say, some background for Dawson. This is what the lawyers really liked. So this is the judge's decision. The city of Dawson entered a guilty plea, this was back in 2000, alleging that on August 16th, 2000, it did deposit a permit to be deposited a deleterious substance contrary to the Fisheries Act. This was, of course, a long judicial summary. This was item 58. The charge before the court relates to one sewage sample taken on August 16th in the year 2000. They were charged, and he said, nevertheless, I am satisfied that the City of Dawson's discharge of sewage into the Yukon during the spring and summer since 1983 was frequently, if not continuously, in violation. That singular sort of comment set into play now, which has unrolled what will the expenditure probably of $35 million. Up until the work they're doing now, they'd spent probably $8 million just on various studies. They had a design that was ready to be issued and all sorts of things. So this is sort of the court context of that, which I think is very interesting. This was a report that I worked on with Inuit, Taparit, Kanatami, and essentially they were putting forth general position for all of the Nunavut or the Inuit regions of Canada, Iqaluit, Nunavut, Nunavik, and Northern Labrador, Nunatsiat-Put, I think I'm pronouncing that correct, and basically commenting on the fact that the communities of the Inuit regions are very small, very remote, and very cold. Therefore, the sewage management technologies must take these conditions into play. But in the context of doing the research, but also providing the resources in the context of the science, meaning how does the thing actually work? The applied science is what the engineers do. How do you actually build it? But is really as emerging, and this is a term that I started using a few years ago, it's all the other stuff. And I'm calling it the social science. You've got the finance, admin, operators, operator training. There's probably a half a dozen things that fit into the context of the social science. that really have to be dealt with in this broad context of bringing in this harmonization. Back to first principles, and I wanted to present that in the first principles that are as part of the CCME guidelines is that they want these to be driven by continuous improvement. And I don't think there's anybody in this room that will argue that, and I've called the context that I've used for 2 decades is incremental improvement. You're always wanting to do things better in terms of your training, in terms of what machinery, equipment you have to have available. So these incremental improvement in terms of these steps, that's a given. We can, I think, all collectively agree without a doubt this is a good thing. Another principle is that we want flexible implementation reflecting across Canada, and that's a good thing. Again, you do it in steps. There's opportunities for, say, small communities. If you've got a project that's actually carried out over 5 years, this is economic development, right? It provides employment, it provides training, and you want it to be sustained. So doing it in implementation, doing these steps is actually a good thing. Site-specific considerations. This is, again, reflecting back in the other comment, is that the actual rolling out of something like this, we do have the 5-year bit of work, and then actually that's a good thing, but still there's continuing challenges, and there will be, such as getting water samples out, is that will continue to be a challenge forever. I mean, there are on-site technologies, but still, in terms of a regulated, I guess, judicial, something that's in the context of law, it has to be sent out to an accredited lab. Well, where are those labs? Yellowknife in Ottawa and Edmonton. So they are a ways away. So that challenge of getting it out. Environmental risk management, and again, this is a principle, but it's been sort of rolling out. And Dawson is just the challenges. There are actually this slide here shows that this is the Klondike River coming into the Yukon River. The Yukon River suffers from glacial silt, so in fact it's quite dirty. And you can see that right there, is that compared to the Klondike River coming in, the Yukon River is quite dirty. So, and the sewage discharges out into the dirty water. So there have been biologists that have stood up and said the Yukon River itself is more deleterious to fish than the sewage discharge from Dawson City. And this was presented, and in the regulatory context it was not accepted. This is probably, I think, of all the, going back to first principles, is the one segment that I think really has the most are disconcerting. As a consultant, my company would gladly like to collect the fees for the design of mechanical treatment plants across the north. The thing about it is that our long-term interest is in the north is having the work we do operate for a long time, have a sort of a continuing utility, and not be operational for a period of time before the community says we can't afford to operate it, and fine, we're done. So it's that physically responsible and sustainable. So we're talking about Dawson, and its capital cost is $25 million. It's coming from the federal government, but it's going to impose I call it a legacy of about $300,000. We're hoping between $300,000 and $400,000 a year, which for a mechanical plant is actually quite cheap. So that's the really impact is that the sustainability, that $300,000 a year that they're going to have to sustain for a generation. This is a statement, and I probably can be challenged on this one, but as much as regulations define the framework of environmental enforcement, the enforcement officers themselves have a significant degree of influence on the outcome of any enforcement at a community level. I sort of had first-hand experience of this in Fort Smith. There was a regulatory officer there who is actually now retired, and he was a great proponent for the community in terms of recognizing their interests and limitations in their water license compliance issues. And I think that's a sort of a significant, it's getting sort of into the fuzzy area, but I think that is significant. And in conclusion, there is a significant gap associated in the wastewater management between regulatory principles and reasonable practices for the communities in the far north. So we've got the regulators in terms of what they're implementing, and then we've got communities and saying, okay, we've got to operate this thing, and I think we're at a great point in time where we can either implement solutions that are appropriate to the administrative, financial, technical, and human resource capacities of northern communities, which I call it the social science, or we in fact can create a legacy that will be an unreasonable burden to the communities for a generation. And I looked at a generation meaning, how long does a plant last if you put it in? The design life is somewhere between 20 and 30 years, which is a generation. I'll just leave you with that. Thank you very much.